Hey guys, it's Karina here with another video. So today I'm going to be talking about vulnerability. So for Christmas, I got this book called Daring Greatly from a friend, and it is by Brené Brown, and it is all about vulnerability. So in her book, she talks about how vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. On page 39 of her book, she talks about how in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the word vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnere, which essentially means to wound or open an attack or damage. So essentially the perception of the word vulnerability is weakness, and people think that weakness stems from vulnerability, which is a very large myth. This is not true. Vulnerability does not equate to weakness. If anything, in my opinion, vulnerability is strength. And I'm going to dive more into what I mean by that in this video. But yeah, just to start off, I'm going to talk about my journey with vulnerability, and then I'm going to dive into some questions about vulnerability and how to be vulnerable and why vulnerability is so amazing. So my experience with vulnerability. So I would say my experience with vulnerability probably started in high school. I mean, as a kid, you don't experience or have to experience too much vulnerability. Life is pretty easy at that point. But I would say, yeah, in high school is when I had my first encounter with vulnerability. In high school, I was very busy, and there was a lot going on for my family. Both my siblings struggle with bipolar disorder, so they were in and out of hospital the entire time I was in high school. So this made things very difficult for me. The attention was often on them, and they were the top priority, which left me kind of on my own sometimes, and I found myself pouring my energy into my work and my school and my sports and church, and I was very occupied with that and very busy, and it led to the point where I burnt out. And I just remember one day I was just crying, like I was just totally burnt out from all the activities I was doing to preoccupy myself and not think about what I was going through or what my family was experiencing. I was trying to bottle up my emotions and avoid my feelings, and I just remember, totally breaking down. And then I was able to communicate with my parents what was happening, and from that moment on, things were just so much better. I was able to better communicate what I needed from my parents. I was able to go to counseling, and I was able to get the help that I needed, and that was a huge relief for me. And from that moment, it has still absolutely been a challenge to be vulnerable, but it has encouraged me and made me less afraid to be vulnerable. But vulnerability is absolutely something I still work on every single day, and something I still struggle with a lot. I have that feeling every time I want to reach out for help. I'm scared, and every time it does get easier to fight that fear and then reach out and just be like, hey, can we talk? Or hey, I need help. And it's a lot of work to get to that point and say those words, but then once you do, it's so worth it. Like when I think about the people around me and the connections and the friends and the family that I have, and the reason why I'm so close with them is because I've been able to be vulnerable with them. And if it wasn't for that vulnerability, I wouldn't have these amazing close people in my life. So I think that's what's so beautiful about vulnerability. And what motivates me to live in life is the beautiful people around me and the connections I have with those people. So I think that's why vulnerability is so incredibly important in our lives. So a couple of quotes I want to highlight from the book is from page 2. So she talks about how vulnerability is not weakness. The uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure we face every day are not optional. The level to which we protect ourselves from being vulnerable is a measure of our fear and disconnection. So what holds us back from being vulnerable is that fear and disconnection we feel. And we must dare to show up and let ourselves be seen. That is what we must do to achieve vulnerability, which is obviously easier said than done, absolutely. So the first question I want to dive into is why we are so afraid of vulnerability. And I think in society today, like, we are so petrified of vulnerability. It makes me so sad because I think vulnerability is something so beautiful. But I think our society, specifically in North America and in Western society, I find that we're so independent and driven and hardworking focused, and we're all these perfectionists, and we want to do everything on our own, and we don't want help from anybody else. And this mentality is what kills us, I think. And we think we're never enough because we're always wanting more. We're in this consumerist society. So it's very toxic, and it's very hard to be vulnerable when we have this mentality built around us. So I think in the book, it talks about how there are three main things that hold us back from vulnerability, and that is shame, comparison, and disengagement. So we don't want to be vulnerable because we're afraid of the shame we'll experience. We don't want to be vulnerable because of the comparison. We want to be the ideal perfect person, and to do that we think that we should not reach out to others, and we do not want to be compared or seen as weak in the eyes of others. And the last thing is disengagement. We are afraid to try new things. We're afraid to see what people will think of us. So these are the things that hold us back from being vulnerable. And we are afraid that vulnerability means weakness. Now on page 35, let's see here, turning to page 35. Okay, it talks about what vulnerability is, and it talks about what people see vulnerability as. So I highlighted a couple of the ones that resonated with me. So she has a whole list here. But vulnerability is standing up for myself. Vulnerability is asking for help. Vulnerability is saying no. Vulnerability is standing up for myself and for friends when someone else is critical or gossiping. So I just filled in the blank vulnerability is and listed these things. And the question she asks us after that is, does that sound like weakness? Does showing up to be with someone in a deep struggle sound like weakness? And the answer is no. We perceive vulnerability as weakness, but when we consider what vulnerability is and we look at it, those aren't considered weakness. It's not bad to ask for help. And if someone asks me for help, am I gonna see them as weak? No. But then when I ask for help, I see myself as weak. That's the problem. And we need to self-reflect and put ourselves in our friend's shoes. So we need to view ourselves as our friends. If you don't view your friend as being weak for asking for help, then you shouldn't view yourself as weak for asking for help. So that is where we need to change our mentality and shift how we're thinking about vulnerability. Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Vulnerability is power. When we're able to be vulnerable, we're able to show our true selves, and we're able to be with people, and it is the most beautiful thing. It's incredible. I think another big reason why we're so scared to be vulnerable is because of the stigma. So there's a lot of stigma around vulnerability. One of the quotes from page 42 is, "I want to experience your vulnerability, but I don't want to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is courage in you and inadequacy in me. I'm drawn to your vulnerability, but repelled by mine." So this is something I think we experience greatly in today's society, because we see in media and in movies, and we see influencers and celebrities being vulnerable, and we're like, wow, look at that person. They're being so vulnerable. They're so amazing. They're so strong. But then we don't want to be vulnerable ourselves because we're afraid of that, and we don't know how to be like that or do that, which is where the stigma is. So I think another huge issue is that there's a lot of stigma, especially for men, around vulnerability. And I think the truth is we all struggle to be vulnerable, but I do think it is harder for men to be vulnerable as well because of the stereotypes and because there's this perception that they have to be the man, or they can't cry or be vulnerable. So I think it's really important we work towards breaking down that stigma. Another quote that I think is really important from page 43, it says, "When we were children, we used to think that when we were grown up, we would no longer be vulnerable. But to grow up is to accept vulnerability. To be alive is to be vulnerable." Madeline Langan says this. And I love the last part. To be alive is to be vulnerable. And I think that is so true. When I feel most alive is when I'm able to be vulnerable and finally break down that barrier that's in my mind and speak to someone how I'm actually feeling. That is living. And another huge thing that holds us back from vulnerability is shame. We are all afraid to talk about shame. And the less we talk about shame, the more control it has over our lives. Brené Brown says this on page 68. So to overcome this shame, we need resilience and we need self-compassion. On page 75, Brené Brown says, self-compassion is also critically important, but because shame is such a social concept, it happens between people and it heals best between people. So I think something that really goes hand in hand with vulnerability is self-compassion. So another book is the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. So I'm still working through this. I'm halfway done. So I'm going to make a video about this when I'm finished it. But this is another amazing book. And I think something that really goes hand in hand with vulnerability is self-compassion. And when we're able to be vulnerable, to get to the point of vulnerability, I think we need self-compassion, right? We need to accept that what we're going through is normal and we should reach out and get that help. And another thing that holds us back is perfectionism. Perfectionism definitely holds me back in my vulnerability a lot because I am a perfectionist and I don't want to reach out for help. I want to do it myself, and that is a mentality that really, really holds us back. So these are just some of the many, many, many things that holds us back from being vulnerable in today's society. So the next question I want to move to is, how can we be vulnerable? So there's not really a simple answer to this. Honestly, you just need to take the risk and be vulnerable sometimes. And that's scary, really, really scary, but it's worth it in the end. And vulnerability is something that you must work for every single day. And yes, it gets easier, but it's still hard, I would say. And it's still something you have to work towards. And it's also about finding the people you can trust and be vulnerable with. And it's about pushing through that uncomfortableness and choosing to be vulnerable in that moment, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And I promise you that, like, once you push past that uncomfortableness and you are vulnerable, then you'll feel that freedom and that relief, and it's absolutely beautiful. So that perfectly segues into my next point, which is why vulnerability is beautiful and what can be so beautiful about it. So on page 37, Brené talks about how beautiful vulnerability can be. So I'm just going to flip to page 37. Okay, so a couple that I highlighted was vulnerability is freedom and liberation. Vulnerability is the panic, anxiety, fear, and hysteria, followed by freedom, pride, amazement, and then a little more panic. It's like free falling. It's letting go of that control. It's being completely naked. Like, that is vulnerability. And it is so beautiful when we're able to take off that mask and show people who we actually are. It is the most amazing feeling. And it's worth it. It's something that I think we all need to do as people. We all crave vulnerability and close connections. And to have those close connections with people, we need that vulnerability. So the next question I want to kind of dive into is, when is it a good time to be vulnerable? So I think it's very hard to know this, and it's very confusing in our society to know when to be vulnerable. I think we very much have a false perception of vulnerability in our world, especially with social media. I feel like we all think, oh, like, you know, everybody's talking about their issues and problems on social media, so we're all super vulnerable with each other, and it's like, but are we? Like, that's just kind of a false perception, I believe. Yes, people are sharing deep and profound things online, but it's not necessarily a safe space for someone to be vulnerable. Because if someone shares something deep and vulnerable, it's on a very public platform, so it doesn't really create room for people to intimately share and then get that reciprocalness that vulnerability should have. So I'm going to read a quote kind of explaining better what I just said. So on page 45, let's see here. Okay. Vulnerability is based on mutuality, and it requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing. It's not purging. It's not indiscriminate disclosure. It's not a celebrity-style social media information dump. Vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. Being vulnerable and open is mutual and an integral part of the trust-building process. So this is on page 45. So I think that beautifully says it. It explains how vulnerability is something that you have with somebody and how you must trust that person. And I think it goes to show too, like, when we trust that person and that person trusts us, it's a more beautiful moment because then you're both able to be vulnerable with each other. And that's something I struggle with too, and still am learning how to do best, because I think sometimes we're really quick to be vulnerable, or really, I know for myself, I'm really quick to share about my life stories and experiences because I just want to put it all on the table and I want to try to make a connection with someone really quickly. And I don't regret the moments I have done that, but I do think that when you haven't built trust with someone and they trust you and the trust is reciprocal, you're able to receive that vulnerability better. If you're vulnerable with someone you just met, it's not going to be received as well as if you knew that person better and when you know that person better, because they might not be comfortable to be vulnerable with you if they just met you. So maybe you want to wait a bit longer before you open up and be that vulnerable with someone, because it can be a more beautiful moment. But that takes practice, and it's something I think that takes time to learn how to do that. And I do think you do need to be careful with how vulnerable you are sometimes with people too, because when you're too quick to be vulnerable, sometimes too you find that you're a bit exhausted afterwards. I mean, sometimes you're vulnerable when you just met someone and the other person's vulnerable too, but then you, like, afterwards you just feel completely exhausted because you were so quick to be vulnerable with someone that you're just, like, emotionally drained. So vulnerability is definitely one of those things where it's a very fine balance on how you do it. Yeah, so vulnerability, I think it's something that really ties into a lot of different things. It ties into empathy and love and joy. Once we're able to be vulnerable, we can love better, we can experience more joy, we can empathize with people better. So a couple more quotes I want to read. So on page 105, oh, it's so beautiful. It talks about love. So let me get there, page 105. Okay, so this is from the Gifts of Imperfection, one of Brené Brown's other books. So this is what she says is her definition of love. When we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known. When we honor spiritual connection that grows from offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. Love is not something we give or get. It is something that we nurture and grow. A connection that can only be cultivated between two people when it exists within each one of them. We can only love others as much as we love ourselves. Shame, blame, disrespect, betrayal, and the roots of withholding of affection damages the roots of which love grows. Love can only survive these injuries if they are acknowledged, healed, and rare. Oh, that's so beautiful. Okay, yes, so once we're able to be vulnerable, we can experience this great love and experience love in its true form. So I think that's something that's really incredible. Okay, and then on page 125, it explains how being vulnerable can help us to be more joyous and experience joy. So joy comes to us in moments, ordinary moments. We risk missing out on joy when we get too busy chasing down the extraordinary. Being grateful for what you have. When you honor what you have, you're honoring what you've lost. And finally, don't squander your joy. We can prepare for tragedy and loss. When we turn every opportunity to feel joy into a test drive for despair, we actually diminish our resilience. Yes, softening into joy is uncomfortable. Yes, it is scary. Yes, it is vulnerable. But every time we allow ourselves to lean into joy and give into those moments, we build resilience and we cultivate hope. The joy becomes a part of who we are. And when bad things happen, they do happen, we are stronger. So it just goes to show on how when we work on our vulnerability, we're also working on expanding our empathy, our love, our joy, our self-compassion. And vulnerability is just such an amazing way to work on ourselves and to grow and to become better people. And a couple more quotes I just wanted to highlight. So on page 169, when we become defined by what people think, we lose our willingness to be vulnerable. So people's perceptions can really hold us back sometimes. And the other quote I wanted to share was, when you shut down vulnerability, you shut down opportunity. This is on page 208. So I think that's something, once again, so true. When we aren't vulnerable and we keep bottling ourselves in, we're closing ourselves to not be able to grow, and we're closing ourselves to opportunities, to people, to connections, to so many things. So I think the takeaway from this is, I know it's scary, but find that moment, find that person, and be vulnerable. That is my goal and task to you this week or this month. Just find someone who you can trust and who you can deeply share with, and have that vulnerable moment. Ask for help and try not to get held back by the stigma. It is worth it asking for help, and you are not weak if you ask for help. You are strong, and asking for help just shows how much stronger you truly are. Like when I think about my life, if I hadn't asked for help in all those moments, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I wouldn't be the strong person I am today. So I think that it's really important that we seek help and we reach out and we share our stories, but in a safe way. And I think, yeah, I just encourage that you be vulnerable. And I really encourage you to read this book, and I'll link those two books in the description box below. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and please comment if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Alright, bye guys!